Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to continue hearing closing statements from various core participants, beginning with Mr. Menon, who represents Mr. Kebede. Yes, Mr. Menon. Thank you.
Good morning. Truth, justice, and accountability. Those have been the demands of the bereaved and the survivors of the Grenfell Tower atrocity from day one. But what do they mean in the context of a public inquiry? And specifically, what do they mean as far as the Phase 1 terms of reference and list of issues are concerned? Noting the distinction you have made, Mr. Chairman, between what happened to be considered in Phase 1 and why it happened to be considered in Phase 2. After 6 months of evidence, it is clear that this distinction between what and why is easier said than done. You were right to acknowledge at an early stage that you intended to retain a significant degree of flexibility in relation to the scope of the inquiry's 2 phases. Indeed, you have already heard much evidence that goes to the question of why, and you still await much evidence that goes to the question of what. But none of this should delay in our submission your Phase 1 findings and recommendations. We stress this because the inquiry is already way behind schedule. Your initial hope was to complete your Phase 1 report by Easter of this year. And given you still have to consider interim recommendations, hearings for which have recently been postponed and may or may not be rescheduled, and hold individual Article 2 compliant inquests into the deaths of each of those who died as a result of the fire before Phase 2, it is unlikely that Phase 2 will commence before the autumn of next year at the earliest, and possibly not until 2020. In short, your Phase 1 report is urgent. The bereaved and the survivors, and the public at large, need you to make the most robust and decisive factual findings and recommendations that you can on the evidence, so that the criminal and civil liability of those responsible for the Grenfell Tower atrocity can be determined by others as soon as possible. Nothing less, with respect, will do. Now, some of what I say today will inevitably touch on the why as well as the what, as has been the case in the submissions you've already heard, and will be the case in the submissions you hear after me. So, having said that, let's start at the beginning, namely the cause and origin of the fire. We made a number of assertions about this in our opening statement. 1, after Bahailu Kebede heard the kitchen smoke alarm, opened his kitchen door, and saw smoke coming from behind his hotpoint fridge freezer, he did the right thing from start to finish. He shut the kitchen door, woke up his flatmates, woke up his neighbors on the 4th floor, turned off the main electrical switch in his flat, shut the front door of his flat, telephoned the fire brigade on 999, used the stairs to exit the building, waited outside, spoke to the firefighters when they arrived, filmed the fire from outside on his mobile telephone, and just a few hours later went to the police station and gave a full account about what happened. 2, whatever the precise cause or origin of the fire in his kitchen, it was entirely accidental. 3, having heard the evidence, the inquiry must set the record straight and unequivocally declare that Mr. Kebede bears no responsibility, directly or indirectly, for the outbreak of the fire in his kitchen, its spread, and its fatal consequences. Since then, a considerable amount of eyewitness, audio, video, and expert evidence has been adduced, and all of it, without exception, confirms the honesty and reliability of what Mr. Kebede has always said, and confirms that he was indeed blameless for what happened. There is the evidence of Mr. Kebede himself and his flatmates Elsa Afawaki and Almaz Kinfu. There is the evidence of their 4th floor neighbors. There is Mr. Kebede's 999 call. There is the evidence of the first responders, Charlie Batterby, Daniel Brown, John O'Hanlon, and Nicholas Burton. There is the first responders' thermal imaging camera footage. There is Mr. Kebede's mobile telephone video footage. There are the photographs of the kitchen and its contents taken after the fire by the investigators. And finally, there is the expert evidence of Dr. Glover and Professor Nick Dade. Two things that Mr. Kebede did on the night deserve special mention. One, turning off the main electrical switch in his flat before leaving. If Mr. Kebede had not done this, much of Dr. Glover's analysis would have been difficult, if not impossible. If Mr. Kebede had not done this, the fire could have tripped many, possibly all, of the circuit breakers in his flat. Dr. Glover would then have been unable to link the abnormal electrical event that caused the fire to circuit breaker number 7 specifically. In short, Mr. Kebede's quick thinking made Dr. Glover's task as an electrical engineer considerably easier. 2, filming the fire in his kitchen as it spread to the external facade. This footage was taken by Mr. Kebede on his mobile phone whilst he was standing outside Grenfell Tower at ground level looking up. It was given to the police just hours later. It was heavily relied upon by the inquiry's experts, most notably Professor Terrero, Professor Bisbee, and Dr. Lane. Without it, they and you, Mr. Chairman, would have been deprived of crucial video evidence of this most critical stage of the fire's development. Consequently, we trust you will specifically recognize in your Phase 1 report the importance of what Mr. Kebede did on the night and make the following factual findings on cause and origin. 1, the Grenfell Tower fire began in the southeast area of the flat 16 kitchen. 2, the fire was electrical in nature. 3, the origin of the fire was in the hotpoint FF175BP fridge freezer. And 4, the cause of the fire was accidental. We say that none of these factual findings are controversial. There is no evidence suggesting anything to the contrary. Moreover, until Whirlpool's closing submissions were circulated on Thursday last week, we were unaware that any co-participant was arguing anything to the contrary. So what exactly is Whirlpool now saying? 1, although the inquiry can conclude that the fire began in or around the area of the hotpoint fridge freezer in the southeast corner of the kitchen and was caused accidentally, it cannot conclude that the fire was electrical in nature or that it originated in the fridge freezer. 2, as Professor Nick Dade said in her final report, the cause of the fire remains undetermined. 3, Dr. Glover's addendum report on the precise cause of the fire is flawed and based on incorrect assumptions. 4, the exemplar fridge freezer that Dr. Glover compared with Mr. Kebede's fridge freezer had some different component parts. Therefore, Dr. Glover was not comparing like with like. 5, there is no evidence that points uniquely to the fridge freezer. 6, potentially significant evidence may have been shoveled from the kitchen into the hallway and down the lift shaft during the original fire scene investigation. 7, unknown materials in the southeast corner of the kitchen remain unidentified and unexamined. 8, burn patterns to the laminate flooring would have been identical if the fridge freezer had been attacked by fire and therefore do not assist in determining the origin or seat of the fire. 9, the fire may have started non-electrically by somebody throwing something, perhaps a burning cigarette, into the kitchen through the open window that ignited unknown combustible materials in the corner. Now, our response to Whirlpool's submissions is as follows. 1, Assertion by Whirlpool in its closing submissions is not evidence. As far as we are aware, Whirlpool has neither served any expert evidence to counter the evidence and opinions of Dr. Glover and Professor Nick Dade, nor applied to the inquiry for permission to serve such evidence. Whirlpool did serve a preliminary report prepared by a company called Exponent in January 2018, long before Dr. Glover was instructed. But that report says little and takes matters no further, and nothing since then. 2. The most important factual finding on cause and origin that Mr. Kebede wants you to make is that the cause of the fire was accidental. On that narrow issue, there is no conflict between Mr. Kebede and Whirlpool. 3. However, one of the primary objectives of the inquiry is ensuring that a similar catastrophe never happens again. If the fire at Grenfell Tower that killed 72 people did in fact start in a faulty fridge freezer, then you must find accordingly, so that as a society, we can try and regulate in the interest of public safety and prevent similar fires in the future. 4. According to Home Office statistics, there were over 27,000 accidental dwelling fires in England between April 2016 and March 2017. About 16% of those fires, in other words, over 4,360 fires, were caused by faulty electrical appliances and leads. Between 2010 and 2016, there were over 300 domestic fires in England annually that were caused by faulty fridges and freezers. All this information is in the public domain. Whirlpool itself has received 5 prior reports of fire involving the Hotpoint FF175BP model, one of which involved a fridge freezer manufactured in the same month and year as Mr. Kebede's fridge freezer. 5. An issue of growing public concern is the plastic rear casing on many of the United Kingdom's most popular fridges and freezers. Mr. Kebede's Hotpoint fridge freezer had such a plastic rear casing. The London Fire Brigade has been raising concern about this issue for years, as has the consumer rights group Which. Unfortunately, the government has thus far failed to regulate to ensure that all fridges and freezers have protective metal rear casings. Dr. Glover told you, Mr. Chairman, that in the United States, the rear casing of fridges and freezers must be made of a metallic steel. This is a matter to which we will return in due course when you consider interim recommendations arising from Phase 1. 6. Although Professor Nick Dade did state in her final report that the cause of the fire remains undetermined, she clearly changed her mind by the time she gave evidence, having heard Dr. Glover's evidence the day before. Specifically, she agreed with Dr. Glover that the fire was electrical in nature and originated in the Hotpoint fridge freezer. 7. Although potentially significant evidence may have been lost during the original fire scene investigation, there is not a shred of evidence that the fire was caused by a non-electrical event involving, for example, a cigarette or a candle or incense or oil. 8. Whirlpool, in its closing submissions, has completely ignored the evidence in respect of circuit breaker number 7, tripping. This is clear evidence pointing to an electrical fire and specifically to the Hotpoint fridge freezer. 9. Burn patterns to the laminate flooring would not have been identical if the fire had begun elsewhere in the southeast corner of the kitchen and then attacked the fridge freezer. The area under the fridge freezer was clearly subjected to much more heat than the surrounding areas of laminate flooring were, hence the very different burn patterns. 10. Whirlpool, in its closing submissions, has completely ignored the evidence that all the other electrical appliances in both the southeast and northeast areas of the kitchen can be discounted as being seats of origin, namely the cooker, the broken freezer, the small fridge, and the Ethiopian hot plate. the latter three were not even plugged in. 11. It is hardly Dr. Glover's fault that the exemplar fridge freezer provided to the Metropolitan Police Service had different component parts to Mr. Kebede's fridge freezer. It was Whirlpool that provided the exemplar. Why didn't Whirlpool provide the Metropolitan Police Service with an exemplar that had the identical component parts? As far as we are aware, Whirlpool has provided no explanation for this anomaly. 12. As far as the theory of the fire having started as a result of something thrown through the open window is concerned, this is pure speculation and desperate, to put it politely. There is no evidence in support. It would have been impossible for a cigarette or some other mystery item to have been launched from ground level 4 floors down. And it is equally impossible to imagine how a cigarette or some other mystery item discarded from a flat above could have miraculously entered the kitchen through the open window, let alone set anything in the vicinity alight. And finally, 13. I'm afraid, Mr. Chairman, that Whirlpool's closing submissions are a transparent attempt by a multinational corporation with billions in assets to try and avoid liability and minimize reputational damage and financial loss. It is the same strategy that Whirlpool used during the inquests in 2012 into the deaths of 5 members of the Kua family that I mentioned during my opening statement, to try and deflect attention away, in that tragic case, from a Whirlpool freezer that failed electrically and caught fire. You may like to know, Mr. Chairman, that the coroner in that case roundly rejected Whirlpool's submissions. In short, there is more than sufficient evidence for you to conclude that the fire was electrical in nature and originated in Mr. Kebede's hot point fridge freezer, in addition to concluding that the cause of the fire was accidental. As far as the precise cause of the electrical fault that ignited the fire is concerned, we accept that is more complicated. In his addendum report, Dr. Glover concludes that the probable cause was a poor crimp connection that caused overheating and arc damage to the run capacitor wires, a short circuit to circuit breaker number 7, and a subsequent short circuit to the residual current circuit breaker. Professor Nick Dade, whilst conceding that she is not an electrical expert, was not in full agreement as to the precise cause. She did not clarify the matter any further. It's a matter for you, Mr. Chairman, whether or not you make a factual finding as to the precise cause. Suffice to say that you do have the necessary evidence if you wish to make such a finding. Ultimately, you may think that the precise cause is of less importance from the perspective of the public interest and public safety than the question of how an ordinary domestic fire that happens every day in the United Kingdom and is entirely foreseeable managed to penetrate the exterior facade of the building and spread with such ease, speed, and ferocity. Turning then to the more general matters about what happened beyond the confines of Flat 16, the extent to which Grenfell Tower complied with the requirements of the relevant legislation, and the response of the firefighters. Unsurprisingly, some of these matters are simple and straightforward, and others are far more complex and nuanced. Other counsel for the bereaved and the survivors have addressed you on flame and smoke spread once the cladding and insulation caught fire, and how the cladding, the insulation, the architectural crown at the top of the building, the window installations, the doors, and the ventilation system all played their part in flame and smoke spread. I don't wish to be repetitious and consequently have nothing to add. On compliance, I'll be brief as well, as this too has been addressed by others at length. Grenfell Tower, as refurbished, was non-compliant in multiple respects with the building regulations and approved document B, regardless of how unfit for purpose and impenetrable those regulations might be. There is simply no rational basis for concluding there was compliance. This is not a borderline case. This is a case of flagrant and extensive non-compliance. The evidence of Professor Torero, Professor Bisbee, and most importantly, Dr. Lane, is unequivocal on this. Specifically, there is no evidence whatsoever to counter Dr. Lane's important conclusion that Grenfell Tower should never have been handed over to its residents and occupied with such a combustible rain screen cladding system, given the stay put policy. Consequently, it is unthinkable, Mr. Chairman, that you will conclude Grenfell Tower was anything other than non-compliant. And it is equally unthinkable that you will conclude you need to delay until the end of phase 2 before making definitive findings on non-compliance. This fundamental issue needs to be decided as soon as possible so that we can start to get to the bottom of why and how this was ever allowed to happen. What about the response of the firefighters? I'm just going to pause for a minute.
When you're ready. Thank you.
What about the response of the firefighters? Having read and heard the closing submissions of other core participants, I'm afraid I do wish to speak to this issue at some length, as it is in our submission far more complex and far more nuanced than some are suggesting. It is very easy, with the benefit of hindsight, gained from all the evidence served in phase 1 and adduced in the relative comfort of Holborn bars. I appreciate that is a controversial statement to some. For lawyers and judges who have almost certainly never been in a towering inferno to pass sweeping, oversimplistic judgments about what the firefighters working under the most extreme conditions did or did not do on the night. What we need, Mr. Chairman, from you is a fair, balanced, and reasoned assessment that recognizes just how difficult it is to predict with any degree of certainty or precision what might have happened in one hypothetical situation or another on the night if different decisions had been made and different actions had been taken. For example, if there had been better contingency planning, as there undoubtedly should have been, or if stay put had been abandoned earlier, as it undoubtedly should have been. We are acutely conscious that the issue of the firefighters is a contentious one amongst the bereaved and survivors. You would have gleaned from their evidence that whereas there is unity on other matters, there are a variety of differing views as to the response of the firefighters on the night. Some believe the firefighters are heroes who did everything they possibly could in an impossible situation. Some believe that fundamental errors were made that contributed to the lives of some being lost. And some are on the spectrum somewhere in between. So this is troubled water to navigate. But navigate it we must with great care and fairness. Were mistakes made on the night? Yes, of course mistakes were made on the night. How could mistakes not have been made, given the nature of the building and the fire? Should lessons be learned from those mistakes? Yes, of course lessons must be learned from those mistakes. It was most unfortunate that Danny Cotton, the commissioner, when praising the firefighters for all their efforts, which she was absolutely right to do, by the way, added that she would not go back and change anything the London Fire Brigade did on the night. that was not only deeply insulting to the bereaved and survivors, but also indicative of an inability on her part, and perhaps on the part of the London Fire Brigade as an institution, to appreciate, even with the benefit of hindsight, the London Fire Brigade's institutional failings and deficiencies pre-Grenfell, as identified by the Fire Brigades Union and others in their closing submissions. However, Mr. Chairman, if the primary focus of your Phase 1 reports degenerates into a wholesale attack on the response of the firefighters, institutionally or individually, that in any way weakens or detracts from your all-important condemnation of the transformation of Grenfell Tower during its refurbishment into a combustible, non-compliant death trap unsafe for human occupation, then that would be perverse and would play straight into the hands of those statutory and corporate core participants who in reality bear full responsibility for the spread of the fire, the failure of the building, and the dreadful consequences that followed. That would not be, and I quote, a fearless reckoning with what went wrong and what must be different in future. The firefighters on the ground at Grenfell Tower were part of the solution, not part of the problem. Whatever mistakes they made, they must not be scapegoated for not knowing on the night what the inquiry's experts have concluded after they and teams of scientists and engineers have spent literally months studying the remains of the building and its contents, conducting experiments and tests, reading the evidence of the firefighters, the bereaved, and the survivors, and investigating what exactly happened at Grenfell Tower on the night of the fire. If the firefighters on the ground at Grenfell Tower are unfairly scapegoated, the only beneficiaries will be the aforementioned statutory and corporate core participants. That is neither justice nor accountability. Now, there are 7 specific issues we wish to discuss about firefighting in general and the response of the firefighters on the night. The first is this. You cannot ignore, Mr. Chairman, the wider context that allowed the Grenfell fire to happen, namely the systematic deregulation of fire safety in this country under successive governments since the Thatcher era, or the draconian cuts of over 30% to central funding of fire and rescue services under austerity. Laws and regulations have been weakened in the name of cutting red tape, all for the benefit of the construction industry. Government-funded fire research has virtually ceased. Fire safety standards have dropped, and the lessons of countless inquiries, inquests, and investigations have been ignored by the state. As far as cuts are concerned, in London alone since 2010, 10 fire stations have been closed, 27 fire engines have been scrapped, and over 600 firefighters have lost their jobs. This is madness. We are one of the richest countries in the world. As a society, there is no point in producing endless reports unless we reverse fire safety deregulation by re-regulating, and unless we reverse cuts by substantially investing in the fire and rescue services and ensuring that they have the very best resources and equipment they need to fight fire and save life in the 21st century. As a society, we must prioritize people and safety over profit. We have the money. The question is how we decide to spend it. The second issue is this. When assessing the performance of the firefighters on the night, Mr. Chairman, you need to make a clear distinction between the institution of the London Fire Brigade and those in senior management positions on the one hand, and the rank and file firefighters on the other. The rank and file, including watch managers like Mike Dowden, are not responsible for the inadequacy of their training on high-rise fires, combustible cladding, compartmentation breach, stay put, and evacuation. The rank and file are not responsible for the inadequacy of contingency planning. The rank and file are not responsible for the non-existence of a high-rise evacuation strategy. The rank and file are not responsible for poor quality equipment, in particular unreliable communication equipment. The third issue is this. Counsel to the inquiry put to a number of senior officers that firefighters should always expect the unexpected. A fair point, they should. But what does the unexpected mean? What does it encompass? Surely the unexpected must be reasonably foreseeable. Or should the firefighters expect the unforeseeable too? Forget Danny Cotton's absurd example of a space shuttle landing on the Shard. Let's consider a real example. Should the New York firefighters have expected 2 airplanes to fly into the World Trade Center on 9/11 and had a specific contingency plan for such an event? Well, that cannot be right. That cannot be proportionate. The need to plan specifically for a major disaster of a kind that has happened before and is therefore foreseeable is one thing. The need to plan specifically for an unforeseeable event that no firefighter in London has experienced or contemplated is another thing altogether. So what was reasonably foreseeable in terms of a high-rise residential fire in London in June 2017? Well, cladding fire was reasonably foreseeable to firefighters. It had happened before, notably at Knowsley Heights in Liverpool in April 1991, the first high-rise cladding fire in the UK, where the fire spread upward and vertically. At Garnock Court in Irvine, Scotland in June 1999, where the fire also spread upward and vertically. And of course at Lakanal House in South London in July 2009, where there was both cladding fire spread and internal fire spread through combustible false ceilings in between floors that undermine compartmentation. What else? Well, compartmentation breach was also reasonably foreseeable to firefighters. It too had happened before, notably at Garnock Court, at Lakanal House, and most recently at Shepherd's Court in Shepherd's Bush in August 2016, where the fire was extinguished. Fire behaving unusually was also reasonably foreseeable to firefighters. What about lateral fire spread and downward fire spread to the external cladding? Well, Professor Torrero's evidence is significant on this point. He stated that lateral fire spread and downward fire spread are rare in high-rise cladding fires. Usually the fire spreads upwards and vertically and then proceeds to decay and eventually extinguish once it reaches the top of the building. Grenfell Tower was clearly different, in large part because of the design and combustibility of its unique architectural crown. What about total building failure? Well, total building failure was certainly not reasonably foreseeable to the rank-and-file firefighters pre-Grenfell. It played no part at all in any training they'd received about high-rise firefighting. What about the London Fire Brigade as an institution pre-Grenfell? That is a tough one. Now, even if it was a foreseeable event for the London Fire Brigade, it was clearly not in fact foreseen on the night. Now, when considering that issue, in other words, the reasonable foreseeability of total building failure to the London Fire Brigade as an institution, you may wish to bear in mind, Mr. Chairman, that none of the high-rise fires in the UK that I've already mentioned, or others that were mentioned in the course of the evidence, resulted in total building failure. Not one of them. Furthermore, none of the recent well-known international high-rise fires resulted in total building failure. For example, the Mermoz fire in Roubaix, France in May 2012, the La Crosse fire in Melbourne, Australia in November 2014, the Marina Torch fire in Dubai in February 2015, and the Egress downtown hotel fire in Dubai in December 2015. There is some information online to suggest that there may have been high-rise fires in China, Iran, and Azerbaijan that resulted in total building failure. But as Professor Torero stated, there is very little detailed publicly available information about most international fires. Even a leading internationally renowned fire expert like Professor Torero does not apparently have access to the necessary information. In short, despite the undoubted similarities between the Grenfell Tower fire and previous high-rise fires in the UK and around the world, and the undoubted lessons that could and should have been learned from those previous fires, the Grenfell Tower fire was unprecedented in the sense that it involved total building failure, whereas none of the other high-rise fires did. Consequently, it is hardly surprising that many prominent and experienced fire investigators have publicly stated that they have never seen a high-rise building completely consumed by fire like Grenfell Tower was. It is important to recognize that total building failure is not simply a question of scale. A large cladding fire that causes a significant number of compartmentation breaches and behaves unusually is not tantamount to total building failure. Total building failure involves the failure of all or most of the fire safety features in the building, such that the fire becomes unextinguishable. At Grenfell Tower, everything failed, with the exception of the concrete core structure of the building. For completeness' sake, I should mention the one fire that did involve total building failure. Although the building in question was neither high-rise nor residential, and the walls and roof were made of plastic as opposed to aluminium with a polyethylene core, namely the fire at the Summerland Leisure Centre on the Isle of Man in August 1973. You know about this, I'm sure, Mr. Chairman. Summerland was a huge indoor holiday park wrapped in a combustible acrylic material without any sprinkler system. When it caught fire from a discarded cigarette, the flames spread quickly. Once the flames became visible to the approximately 3,000 people inside the building at the time, there was mass panic, crushing, and trampling as the crowds headed for the exits. But the fire was too ferocious. It killed 50 and seriously injured another 80. Although it led in the short term to the strengthening of outdated building regulations in the UK, the lessons were not learned by the powers that be. By the early 1980s, the deregulation of fire safety was in full swing. The fourth issue is a brief one, namely the familiarization visits. Others have already addressed to you on Section 7.2d as far as Grenfell is concerned. The familiarization visits were clearly deficient. However, and it's only a small point, but I do think it's important to make, we shouldn't exaggerate what a firefighter conducting a perfect familiarization visit would have been able to discover. Even if a scientist or an engineer like Professor Torero or Dr. Lane had visited Grenfell Tower on the 13th of June 2017 and spent a few hours familiarizing themselves with the building, they would not have known that it was a death trap wrapped in highly combustible cladding, or that it had a number of other dangerous design characteristics that accelerated the speed of fire spread. They would have seen the cladding, but would not have known without research and testing how combustible it was. They would have noted the ventilation system, the doors, the window installations, the single stairs, the absence of sprinklers, and the absence of a central tannoy or alarm system, but would not have known the impact of any of these features in the event of a fire. They would have obtained general insights about the building, but the extent to which such insights would have assisted in fighting a fire of the nature and magnitude of the Grenfell Tower fire is highly debatable. The fifth issue is stay put at Grenfell. The starting point is, of course, that there never should have been a stay put policy at Grenfell Tower in the first place, given the cladding system and the fact that the refurbished building should not even have been occupied. But this is the fault of those who refurbished the building, not the London Fire Brigade. However, given there was a stay put policy, when should it have been abandoned, without the benefit of hindsight. Now, Dr. Lane was extremely fair about this, recognizing the dangers of attributing what we now know to what the firefighters could actually see at different times on the night, and what Mike Dowden, the initial incident commander, actually knew at different times, standing outside the building. Consequently, even though the fire had spread from inside the flat 16 kitchen to the external facade by about 1:08 a.m., begun to climb vertically by about 1:13 a.m., and breached compartmentation by about 1:15 a.m., Dr. Lane was of the view that the fire was still localized and there was no need for the firefighters to think the fire could not potentially be mitigated. However, once it continued to climb, and in particular went beyond the 11th floor, and then eventually reached the top of the building by about 1:26 a.m., the building design condition for stay put had failed substantially. In other words, at or around 1:26 a.m., stay put should have been abandoned and an evacuation of the building organized. We agree. By about 1:26 a.m., notwithstanding the fire had yet to spread laterally, Mike Dowden should have realized there was a real risk of multiple compartmentation breaches across multiple floors, whatever he heard or didn't hear on his radio. From what he himself could see happening to the east face of the building, or at the very least should have made inquiries with the bridgehead over the radio as to what firefighters and residents inside the building were saying about internal fire and smoke spread. However, given Dr. Lane's cogent reasoning, we do not believe you should make a factual finding that stay put should have been abandoned earlier than 1:26 a.m., as others have suggested. The fact that Mike Dowden deployed a covering jet externally and ordered a more aggressive hydraulic pump by about 1:15 a.m. does not mean that he had already concluded that defend-in place on which stay put depends was no longer viable throughout the building. The mere fact that he recognized that he was fighting an external fire of substance does not mean he should have ordered the immediate evacuation of the building. Nobody amongst the experts is suggesting that. One final note on this issue. This may not be popular with some, but I have a great deal of sympathy for Mike Dowden. It's not his fault that the building behaved as it did after the fire spread beyond its compartment of origin. It's not his fault that he was inadequately trained to be an incident commander for a fire of this nature or magnitude. It's not his fault that the London Fire Brigade failed to replace him with a more senior and experienced incident commander much sooner than they in fact did. It is not his fault there was no London Fire Brigade evacuation strategy in the event of stay put no longer being viable. As Mike Dowden acknowledged when he gave evidence, he was overwhelmed on the night. I trust, Mr. Chairman, you will not make him the sacrificial lamb. The sixth issue is evacuation. I don't want to spend too long on evacuation because the evidence as to how a mass evacuation of the building at or about 1:26 a.m. would have been organized and implemented, how long it would have taken, and what practical difficulties and environmental complications would likely have arisen is thin indeed at present. I trust you agree that it would be wrong to speculate and make factual findings as to what might have happened without the most careful consideration of all the evidence and all the likely variables that might have affected a mass evacuation of the building. As yet, you have no sophisticated computer modeling on how a hypothetical evacuation would have worked in practice. I assume that the inquiry's expert, Professor Galea, from whom we have yet to hear, will be doing an in-depth report on evacuation modeling for Phase 2. All you have at the moment is the evidence of Professor Purser, the inquiry's expert on toxicology, who estimated that the ideal nominal evacuation time of all 293 occupants of the building to the lobby was 7 minutes, if they all suddenly went into the stairs simultaneously, which obviously wouldn't have happened. In his report, he qualifies that estimate by adding that given the presence of slower, more elderly occupants and young children, and the need to assist those with limited mobility, a better estimate was about 15 minutes. Now, to be fair to Professor Purser, he never suggested that his calculations were particularly scientific, and they clearly were not. They were based on the fact that it took him 3.5 minutes to descend the stairs from top to bottom when he visited the site, the dimensions of the stairs, and his opinion as to the likely standing density per square meter on the stairs. He was frank that his figures required a scenario that was in fact impossible at Grenfell Tower, namely alerting all those present in the building to evacuate simultaneously by means of a general alarm system in the common areas. Furthermore, he did not consider a number of other obvious variables that would have slowed down any hypothetical evacuation, such as the inevitable presence of firefighters under BA ascending the stairs in large numbers to assist with the evacuation, and the inevitable impact of fear, panic, noise, disorientation, and smoke inhalation on those evacuating. In the circumstances, you cannot possibly at present, Mr. Chairman, put a figure on how long a hypothetical evacuation would have taken, or reach any non-speculative conclusions as to how many of those who died in the fire might have survived if stay put had been abandoned earlier. There is no alternative, I'm afraid, but to defer your assessment in respect of this hypothetical evacuation until phase 2. The seventh and final issue is the future of stay put. In a sense, this is a largely academic issue. The reality is that the next time there is a fire in a high-rise residential building in the UK, and sadly there will be a next time, sooner rather than later, given the sheer number of tower blocks with similar cladding, most residents will evacuate as soon as they find out about the fire, regardless of whether the building has a stay-put policy and regardless of the extent of any compartmentation breach or external fire spread. For the foreseeable future, the memory of what happened at Grenfell will drive residents to get out and stay out. Nevertheless, given your remit includes making recommendations so that a similar catastrophe never happens again, you're going to have to engage with stay put more generally. So, should stay put be consigned to the dustbin of history? Should it be replaced in all high-rise residential buildings with a policy of get out and stay out whenever there is a fire of any nature? I don't want to labor the point, Mr. Chairman, but in a safe, compliant high-rise building, stay put has an inherent logic, however counterintuitive it may be. It works, it saves lives, and it has been doing so for decades, not just in this country, but internationally. In the vast majority of high-rise fires, there is either no compartmentation breach or very limited compartmentation breach confined to a localized sector of the building. To evacuate the entire building in such circumstances is not only unnecessary, but can also carry its own dangers in terms of promoting panic and chaos and exposing residents to smoke inhalation and injury that they would not otherwise face. Consequently, getting rid of stay put altogether, because it should never have been enforced at Grenfell post-refurbishment, would in our view be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. What we need is a more reasoned approach involving a proper review and risk assessment of every tower block, its fire safety features, and the viability of a stay-put policy given the building's design, carried out by a suitably qualified person. And despite stay-put being a principle of building construction, firefighters have to be properly trained in how stay-put applies, how to identify when it is no longer viable, and how to facilitate the evacuation of different types of tower blocks depending on their design and fire safety features. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, Friday is the 18-month anniversary of the fire. So far, there have been no prosecutions and no bans. There's been a lot of talk and very little action. Throughout, the bereaved and the survivors, including the Hailu Kebede, who I represent, have shown great patience, great integrity, and great courage, despite all the trauma, despite all the undoubted rage, and despite the hardship. That now, they need you, Mr. Chairman, to be bold and brave too. Are you going to challenge vested interests? Are you going to expose corporate wrongdoing? Are you going to recognize how austerity destroys lives? Are you going to demand the re-regulation of fire safety? Are you going to speak truth to real power in this country? Or are you going to blame the working men and women who risk their lives every day and did their very best on the night but were unable to fight a fire that could not be fought? The time has come. Please, Mr. Chairman, use your power wisely and do the right thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Menon. Well, the next statement is coming from a representative of the group known as G11, but I think it might be sensible to have a short break at this point so we can rearrange things, and then we'll continue. I'm going to say at 11:05 then, please. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Thomas, you're going to address us next, I think.
I am.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the one thing that you and I can probably agree on is that you haven't heard of Signet. Do you know
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Signet.
How do you spell it?
Sinait.
No.
Okay. Well, let me tell you about Signet. In 2015, the local population of Signet from a census indicated the population was 25,000. Signet is a small, picturesque fishing village with white sand beaches, crystal clear waters, and it's located on the South China Sea in the northern province of the Philippines. It's about 441 kilometers from Manila. Its main commodity is garlic, hence it's known as the garlic centre of the north. Its inhabitants are known for their building skills in shipping. The other interesting thing about Signet is that it houses the miraculous statue of the Black Nazarene, or El Santo Cristo Milagroso, locally known as Apolake. In the year 1620, local fishermen from Signet and another nearby village called Badok found a black box floating in the sea with two statues. One of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the other of the Black Nazarene. And according to legend, sir, fishermen from Signet were mysteriously unable to move the statue of the Blessed Mary, whereas fishermen from Badok were unable to move the statue of the Black Nazarene. So each group of fishermen carried the respective statues that they were able to carry back to their local villages. The Black Nazarene became the patron saint of Signet. Apparently, in 1656, an epidemic was raging through Signet, and it was said that through the devotion of the faithful, many people got cured. Sir, just over 72 years ago, 3 weeks ago, on the 24th of November, 1946, my client, Mr. Elipido Bonifacio, was born in Signet. At the time, the population was 13,000. On the 14th of June, 2017, Mr. Bonifacio was the last person taken out of the Grenfell Tower at 8:08 a.m. Mr. Bonifacio resided in flat 83, which is on the 11th floor. Before the refurbishment, it was the 8th floor, where he lived with his wife, Rosetta, for 36 years. Rosetta is here today. Because of disability, he was unable to self-evacuate. That night, his daughter-in-law made 4 frantic 999 calls on his behalf. Throughout the night, into daylight, he moved backwards and forth from the windows of one of the bedrooms, waving a towel, waiting to be seen and to be rescued. With flames engulfing the entire building in the early hours of the 14th of June, Mr. Bonifacio prepared to die, like many of the other residents in Grenfell. His personal chronology of waiting to die is harrowing. He believed his fate was sealed. The image of Mr. Bonifacio waving at the window was picked up by heli-tele footage and indeed news footage in which he appears to be a poignant figure in desperation, trapped inside Grenville as dawn was breaking. Sir, Mr. Bonifacio's oral testimony would have provided this inquiry with a unique, powerful, and invaluable perspective. What is unique about Mr. Bonifacio's survival, and what I have not yet revealed, is that Mr. Bonifacio was not only elderly, not only did he have frailties, but Mr. Bonifacio is blind. Yet, this blind, frail, elderly resident trapped in Grenville survived and was the last man out. Now, I don't know whether the Black Nazarene, also known as El Santo Cristo Milagroso, or locally known as Apolake, was looking down on this blind, frail, elderly son of that fishing village known as Sinat, but he survived, apparently against all the odds. He was finally rescued by firefighters from flat 83 on the 11th floor at 8 minutes past 8 in the morning. And sir, here's the thing. Mr. Bonifacio wanted to assist you with this inquiry and personally give his account, and yet he was not permitted. He wanted to give you an oral account of his experience during the fire and the efforts that took to rescue him. Indeed, his legal team compiled footage of the fire showing the fire spread around flat 83, the impact of the ground monitoring in order to prevent the fire spread around his flat and effectively preventing the fire spread into flat 83, which we would have wished to presented during Mr. Bonifacio's evidence as part of the record. To date, this has not happened. We trust and can only hope that this evidence will form part of the record of evidence relating to that night in due course. Sir, do you know where Penal is?
This is becoming a panel game.
Let me tell you. Penal is a small village in the south of Trinidad on that twin Caribbean island state known as Trinidad and Tobago. It lies south of San Fernando and north of the town of Spiraya. It was originally a rice and cocoa producing area. Raymond Herbert Bernard was born in Penal. Raymond, or Moses, as he was known to close friends and family, was one of 7 children born to Rose Bernard, her third child, born on the 22nd of May, 1954. He had 4 sisters, 2 brothers, and he was the father of 3 and an uncle to many and admired by many. Raymond, who arrived in the UK in 1969, one of the later Windrush generation, attended Isaac Newton Boys' School in Ladbroke Grove, went on to do his apprenticeship and become an electrical engineer when he was 16 and worked at the House of Lords. Raymond loved reggae and soul, and in the early part of the 70s, he was part of the Gemini sound system. Sir, a sound system is a system that comprises of a group of young DJs with their portable decks, powerful speakers, and amplifiers who travel back and forth to play records that can be transported from venue to venue. Raymond was in a long-term relationship with his partner and companion, Karen, and they shared a dog named Marley, apparently a King Charles Spaniel. Both Raymond and Karen loved Marley as if he were their only child. Raymond suffered with ill health, severe arthritis, thus making his escape from the 21st floor of Grenville impossible without assistance and a properly functioning lift. Sir, neither Raymond or Marley made it out of Grenfell. Mr. Bonifacio and Mr. Bernard were good friends. Mr. Bonifacio, Raymond, and Marley would often go to the bookies together or to the local pub. Mr. Bonifacio, who survived, misses his friend Moses. Sir, unfortunately, Grenfell Tower is now synonymous with lost lives, lost loves, lost opportunities. So to the task at hand. So many of our clients have spent the last 18 months in temporary accommodation battling with the authorities that have failed them. Nonetheless, they remain stoic and resolute in their quest for truth, justice and accountability. Sir, as you retire to contemplate the next stage of these proceedings, yes, there are many heart-wrenching stories of that night. For example, Nabil and Malik Shakir, who lost six of their family members, mother, sister, 3 nieces, Malik's brother who was married to Nabil's sister, all trapped in the upper floors of that tower. It's difficult to remain unmoved by Nabil's sheer desperation and bravery that night. He begged, he pleaded in desperate attempts to get inside Grenfell Tower on the morning of the 14th of June, to get past the police cordon, to make contact with his family trapped inside that tower. He too was not offered the opportunity to give oral testimony before this inquiry, which is a pity, because that would have been cathartic. He was not placed at the heart of this inquiry. He really wanted to give oral evidence, yet his evidence was not called. Yes, sir, there are many personal stories of that fateful night, all painful, all raw, all heartbreaking. It's also important to note this and recognise that those of us who represent the bereaved survivors and relatives are not necessarily a homogenous group who engage with the process in the same way. Many engage in this process in many different ways, sir. Also, at times, they seek different outcomes. Our client, Mr. Shakir, who sits in front of you today, his position is, and I say this on his behalf, that the following factors were responsible for the death of his family members. He wishes to state that the government failure to safeguard the residents after major fires, including Lucknow, with more robust building regulations. He wishes to state decisions made in relation to the installation of the flammable cladding is responsible. He wishes to state decisions made in relation to budget cuts in emergency services, the fire services, the police, the ambulance. He wishes to state decisions made in relation to the refurbishment works, the decisions made in relation to rescue and evacuation, the decision made to stop, miscommunications and information about rescue. I am merely his voice to you, sir. Let me continue. Sir, although this inquiry has admitted the statements from the Metropolitan Police Service and the London Ambulance Service, witnesses who attended the Grenfell Tower as part of the blue light emergency response into evidence, many of our clients have questions of these witnesses that can only properly be answered through oral evidence, of which we detailed in our written submissions to you on the emergency responders, and I trust in the next phase you'll take the opportunity to consider those. In particular, we had urged and continue to urge the inquiry to call the Metropolitan Police responders, PC Sangha and PC Rees, to give oral evidence during the remaining section of Phase 1. Their unique perspective is that of another emergency service with perhaps a different culture than the London Fire Brigade. Their assessment of the incident shortly after arrival, in particular Sangha's assessment of the need for evacuation of the building at 1:28, was a critical time when more lives could have been saved. We're mindful of Dr. Barbara Lane's assessment that stay put should have been abandoned at 1:26 and that safe evacuation of those physically able was possible up until 1:40, or later, depending on variables such as the floor, It is therefore essential to know what discussions PC Rees had with the incident commander, if at all, and whether there was a discussion about evacuation given the Metropolitan Police Service's initial assessment. Likewise, sir, the evidence of the helicopter pilots is critical to our client's understanding of the response of the emergency responders and how their loved one died. The evidence is particularly important to the Shakir family, the family of Raymond Bernard, and the family of Gloria Trevisan. It is imperative that the Metropolitan Police control room operators who advise Zainab Dean to wave at helicopters is called to answer questions relating to that advice given. Our clients are genuinely concerned that other residents who travelled from the floor to the roof were advised to do so by members of the emergency services in order to be rescued by helicopters. This concern is corroborated by Farid Nihal's evidence that Mrs. Afra Shihabi, one of the Iranian ladies on the 18th floor, mentioned that they had been told that helicopters would rescue them from the top. Farhad also recorded discussion about them going to the roof, onto the roof, to be rescued by helicopters, although Farhad didn't know the source of that information. It was apparent that that information had been received, apparently in a phone call. Mrs. Nida was also unclear whether the advice to wait to be rescued by helicopters from the roof had come from firefighters. Sir, our client's own suspicions that the presence of the helicopters gave residents, particularly those on the upper floor, a false hope that they would indeed be rescued. And that was shared by Fahad and other firefighters, as we've heard from firefighter Alan Moore. These concerns, sir, can only properly be allayed from the testimony of the Metropolitan Police control staff who took the calls from residents in the tower and disclosure of the MPS's call handling guidance protocols. In addition to providing our clients with the answers to these questions concerning their loved ones who died, this evidence is also necessary to identify the advice given by the Metropolitan Police Service call handlers to callers trapped in order to ensure that lessons are learned from the Grenfell Tower fire. Society is well used to and trusting of advice given over the telephone and looking forward online in our interconnected world to not properly examine this in the light of the events on the 14th of June fails to take an opportunity that may never come again, sir, and we ask you to consider that. Martin Luther King Jr. said this: "Never, never be afraid to do what's right. Society's punishments are small compared to the wounds we inflict on our own souls when we look the other way." Sir, we hope you do not look the other way. On the 6th of June, in my opening statement, I said on behalf of G11, there has, in the openings of others, been criticisms of the firefighters' capabilities and their reactions on the night. That is something that will undoubtedly be considered. However, we must not lose sight of the primary issues. I repeat that. Let's not lose sight of the primary issues. Refurbishments, the works. I also said on a previous occasion that when 72 souls were lost in the most horrendous and awful way, those responsible should hang their heads in collective shame. Having heard 6 months of evidence, there is nothing to make me alter my view about those sentiments. The fact that mass fatalities, mass personal, both physical and psychological injury, and mass homelessness of innocent residential dwellers is, quite frankly, outrageous. The fact that it was caused in this way is just shocking. Those scars are wounds which are just as raw today. Previously, we said that there were many important questions that needed to be asked. So some of those questions have been answered. But there's still many more questions which will be left for the next phase of your inquiry. The fact remains that, and this cannot be avoided, sir, once a reasonably safe block was turned into a death trap. And I echo, but do not repeat, the submissions made by some of my other colleagues who have come before me. Sir, I previously said that whilst those responsible for the refurbishment may dispute just how unsafe they made Grenfell Tower, it is incontrovertible that the tower was intentionally rendered significantly less safe by the introduction of highly flammable material to its structure and exterior. We stand by those remarks. It is clear now that this fact wasn't communicated to the London Fire Brigade. The fire safety of several hundred people deliberately compromised in their own homes, and yet public servants ultimately responsible for protecting them in the event of a fire was simply never told, still less consulted. So, key questions in Grenfell. How on earth did this happen? What went so tragically wrong? Why is it that so many people died? We say, at this stage, sir, you can answer those questions. When my corporate colleagues get to their feet to address you after those of us representing the bereaved survivors and relatives sit down, sir, please be aware of this. Be wary of attempts to distract, divert, rewrite history, or blame others in an attempt to conceal the truth. Remember, sir, that although we have not yet heard all the evidence, and we still have yet to hear the evidence of Mr. Ahmed, who sits before you, who was the chair of the Leaseholders Association, remember, he asked Kensington and Chelsea to conduct a full health and safety audit of Grenfell Tower. He delivered the dossier to Kensington and Chelsea 2 weeks before that fire, and yet those steps were not taken. Don't forget, he repeatedly told the TMO to provide and carry out a fire drill, queried the absence of any fire safety advice for the residents of Grenfell. This disaster happened because ordinary people were ignored. It is a direct consequence of that failing. Sir, we've now had the pleasure of your company for the best part of, nearly 7 months? And having seen the way that this hearing has been conducted, how your inquiry team have operated and how the other core participants have conducted themselves, what we can agree on, as night must surely follow day, is you're not going to please everyone. There simply has not been consistency in the demands made of you. It is clear from the written submissions of the core participants that you cannot take a sword of Solomon approach to this tragedy that engulfed this residential block back in June 2017, split it down the middle and dispense justice to satisfy all. It ain't going to happen in that way. In fact, the evidence simply does not permit you to do that. It simply does not fall in that way. So as I got to my feet, you probably thought, what's that Leslie Thomas going to say today? What's he going to complain about now? This time on behalf of G11. And it is true that during this inquiry, there have been certain themes to the requests that I have made of my clients. But in fairness to me, I have to do my best to hold this inquiry to account, and I have to do it fearlessly. Sir, you know and you appreciate that those demands have only been made with good intention, trying to assist you and your team in this traumatic process for those I represent. And I honestly hope that the requests were made with respect, politely, and with the right tone and sense of humour. So, from the perspective of the people who have been ignored for so long, at their personal cost, that they feel the need to make complaints, and yes, they haven't been happy with all aspects of this process. Just by way of example, the way that some of the questions have been put, the lack of the opportunity to put questions through their own counsel, having sufficient time to take instructions in between the question of witnesses. So as we move from this phase to phase 1B and phase 2, we submit that it is necessary for our clients' questions are asked of questions through their own counsel. As you and your counsel will well appreciate, your team will have to take a very neutral role in the next phases of this hearing. And some may argue, and we certainly do argue, that they're not properly or best placed to ask the searching and robust questionings that our clients need to be asked. The venue and its lack of suitability. You may not know this, sir, but one of my clients, Cordella Disson, the widow of Anthony Disson, Tony Disson, and other members of the Disson family, are among the clients who would have wished to attend these hearings more frequently. But unfortunately, they've been unable to travel to central London. Mrs. Disson suffers from panic attacks and has difficulty travelling in public transport. In addition, sir, we have several clients who've been diagnosed with PTSD as a result of this incident, which makes travelling to this inquiry extremely difficult, particularly in rush hour. Like many other clients, Mrs. Disson considers the layout of this courtroom ill-suited for their needs. So you will remember days when particular witnesses, for example, Danny Cotton, when she was given her evidence, this room was filled to capacity. And at times during breaks, people had to swap places. Start times. A small request as we move forward. So can we please stick to the agreed start times? I know it's difficult, but we have said, and we did announce 10 o'clock, and we did say that we would aim to finish by 4 o'clock. We've counted them on 23 occasions, sir. 23 we've started at 9:30. Now, don't get me wrong. We fully understand that there are times, because of the pressure on the evidence, we need to get through the evidence. We get that, we understand that. Whilst we as lawyers understand that and fully appreciate the inquiry's case management duties, our clients are trying to make the best efforts to fit in with your timetabling around their daily commitments, school runs, childcare arrangements, hospital appointments. And so all we ask is, if you can, more advance notice of time changes. That would be greatly appreciated. Disclosure, or sometimes the lack of it, or sometimes the fact that it comes late. An example would be of late disclosure would be the helicopter footage, which represented the visual image of the fire spread, which actually located people on various floors. One example, sir, there was images of persons in flat 193, the Shukir family home, which was seen in the footage between 2 and 3 a.m. So as a result of that late disclosure of that helicopter footage received on the 21st of September and the NAPS pilot statements received on the 28th of September, our clients were unable to ask critical questions of witnesses from the control room, And just to give you 3 examples, the control room operators Sharon Darby, who gave evidence on the 1st and 2nd of August, Peter Duddy, who gave evidence on the 13th of September, and the control room manager Joe Smith, who recommended the abandonment of stay put. Additionally, sir, our clients wanted to ask the CROs and the senior fire officers in the control room questions about the advice given and the change of the stay put with the use of images. These images would have been relevant to questions asked of Mr. Dowden. It was a missed opportunity. So I now come to the issue of diversity, or I should say, lack of it. Sir, when is the diversity panel going to be in place? It's now almost some 7 months since the Prime Minister's decision on the 10th of May 2018 for the appointment of a panel to sit with you. We've repeatedly called for the urgent appointment of a diverse panel and expected, although those expectations may have been false, that that panel would have been appointed before the autumn to hear the evidence of the bereaved survivors and relatives and the experts. Well, that didn't happen. So we respectfully ask you to urgently appoint that diverse panel before the end of 2018 or at the very latest, the start of 2019. We say that for the following reasons. We would ask that the remit of the panel includes a review of the evidence already heard and received into the record, and that you sit with the panel for the remaining of the evidence of Phase 1 relating to those who died and who had near-death experiences in the discharge of the Article 2 function. This is a matter of concern for our clients and indeed the general public. Having a voice in this inquiry. There has been struggle at times for our clients to be heard in this inquiry. In the face of great adversity and the challenges of our clients, some of whom are grief-stricken with the personal loss from their loved ones, they continue to suffer mental anguish and post-traumatic stress. Yet, many of them struggle to get here. As you move on to the next phase, can we make another small ask? And it's this. A sickness protocol for absentee witnesses. What we mean by that is this. So as you move into phase 1B and phase 2, dealing with the movements of those who died or had near-death experiences, we would ask you to create or adopt a protocol in relation to witnesses not being called on medical grounds. We raise this and we use 2 examples. Peter May and Graham Winch, both witnesses who were excused on medical grounds. The inquiry excused Mr. Winch for medical reasons, and we felt that initially that was done without providing sufficient detail. I'm sure there was good reason, but it's just the question of involving all, so we know we, as our clients are concerned, that in the absence of a proper protocol requiring clear medical evidence, where witnesses to be excused on medical grounds, our clients are concerned, and these are not unfounded concerns, that there may be a risk that witnesses may try to rely on illness as a way of avoiding giving evidence. Now, what you need to do, sir, is allay those concerns, and those concerns can be allayed with a protocol that everybody understands. So now, the good news. So I'm not here to remind you of any of those matters that I've just mentioned. You may be wondering why I'm on my feet. Well, let's put aside those asks. I'm not here to complain about process today. What I am here to say to you is, and you may well be thinking, has Mr. Thomas suddenly been disabled with that dreaded Michaelmas festive Titus Goodwillius, that commonly known Latin disease that hits people at this time of the year? I know that you and your team have got a lot of work to do. and you're probably going to have a very short break before you start that work, because there is much work for you and your team to do at this stage of the proceedings. No, today is a day not to complain, but today's the day to let you know our thoughts on how you go forward, and that's what I propose to do now. Non-compliance with building regulations. What we say respectfully you need to be careful of, and now, is the fact that there may well be attempts to divert and distract the reaching of necessary conclusions to the end of phase 1, namely clear and unambiguous evidence given by the experts, which has been so vividly backed up by the survivors and firefighters. We say, sir, that the failure of the Grenfell Tower, that this tragedy was caused because the tower failed, and that failure was massive and systemic. We know that in clear and stark terms. We know that because in clear and stark terms, your experts have said so. The tower failed for the following reasons, and so I'm not going to repeat in any great detail what you've heard already. I'm just going to highlight some bullet points for you. Firstly, overarching of all the failures was the decision to wrap this building in flammable material, the cladding system, including the repositioning and insulating of the windows. It was so dangerous, it meant that a multiple compartment fire became inevitable. You have our written submissions, and you have the written submissions of the other CPs as to why that work is so incontrovertible that the works to install the cladding did not comply with building regulations. So we say, we say that you're empowered to do this, that the cladding system was the primary cause of the fire that spread so significantly that it meant that in Grenfell, stay put was no longer viable. And secondly, that the works to install the cladding system undoubtedly made the tower less safe than it was beforehand. So, as Dr. Lane said, this tower should not have been occupied at all. And worse still, it seems that no one grappled with that fact at the time. Just as they are doing now, all the people involved seem to be convincing themselves that it was somebody else's job to put safety before profit. We say, sir, don't accept that excuse, that defence. Not me, Gov, someone else. So never has there been a truer saying than more people would learn from their mistakes if they weren't so busy denying them. The facts in front of our eyes are stark and obvious, and we know that this inquiry will not shirk from them. Nothing less than the clear finding of non-compliance with the building regulations will do, and so we know you know that. Let me move on, sir. Sir, the responsible parties have had ample opportunity, yet none of them have sought to advance a positive case as to why the work to install the cladding system was compliant. Indeed, some appear to accept that such a view would be untenable. Others are content to explain why others, not them, are responsible. This is why the cries of unfairness by some of the corporate participants are misguided and are not analogous to the ones made by my clients in phase 1. Because in phase 1, sir, we're not looking at blame. This is not about blame at this stage, but it's about the experiences my clients have had, which is central to the story as to what happened on the night, and which is why we say there's a distinction between their right to participate and that right is properly protected. So, sir, we will argue about who was responsible for that state of affairs in phase 2. That will come. But let's not detract from the knowledge that somebody must be responsible for this terrible state of affairs in violation of the law. and that much demands the immediate recognition by this inquiry. The time for action is now, not in a year or in 2 years' time. So, sir, the reasons are set out in detail in our written submissions. I urge you to look at the submissions of G11 along with G4 and G3 to assist to declare that the refurbishment works done to Grenfell Tower were not compliant. Can I just touch upon a few other failures of the building? And I hope to do them so very quickly. Importantly, Dr. Lane confirmed that in her opinion that the building should not even have been occupied, even if all active and passive fire protection measures in the tower were fully compliant and in working order. In other words, the cladding system made the design incompatible with the stay put and unlawful. Even if, for example, fire doors, smoke extractor system were compliant, the fire lift worked, and the wet risers present. In her view, it was simply not possible to mitigate the type of fire that those materials would cause. Of course, unfortunately, those other fire safety measures were not there, all working on the night. And so the cladding was not the only reason why the tower was a death trap. The fact, sir, that the fire doors to the entrances of 120 flats had been replaced in 2011 and did not comply with fire safety standards. There was only one stairwell. This was the only escape route, which was smoke-filled as a result of the fire. The lifts failed to perform effectively, hindering the transportation of firefighting equipment, creating an unnecessary risk. The tower's dry riser was non-compliant with the standards of the time of construction and non-compliant with the current standards. The smoke control system failed or was inadequately designed, and there was no sprinkler system, reducing the ability to improve both escape and firefighting conditions. These matters, sir, are secondary to the cladding system in terms of causes of the fire, but they each contributed in significant ways to making the job of firefighting very much harder and the ability of the occupants to self-evacuate fatally undermined. So that brings me to the issue of firefighting. These are our two main points. This is an issue we have made written submissions on. Of course, events should have unfolded differently. Yes, serious mistakes were made. Lessons must be learned. Critically, however, it must be understood and repeatedly asserted that a compliant building would not have rendered the safety of so many of its occupants reliant on the decisions of the fire brigade. As Dr. Lane states, that is the foundation of an effective, safe, stay-put policy. The point being here that whilst criticisms will be made of the fire brigade and the advice they gave to occupants, if the building had not been made so dangerous and stay put was still working, they would not have had to rely on the fire brigade at all to put the fire out, save for, sir, putting the fire out in flat 16. As Dr. Lane confirmed, that is the foundation of a stay-put policy. Although Dr. Lane does not go so far as to state that the internal firefighting was fundamentally incompatible with simultaneous evacuation in the tower, it is clear that the spread of fire and smoke would have posed serious threats to the health and safety of residents and significant obstacles to effective firefighting in any event. For example, it is telling that Dr. Lane believes stair doors being kept open during firefighting activities was the most likely cause of the hot zone on the mid-floors, which so obstructed escape and rescue. So the point here is that the fire service were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. The Civil Contingency Act. So we have set out in our written submissions the failings of Category 1 responders to adopt a coordinated approach and response to the Grenfell Tower in the fulfilment of their statutory duties under the Civil Contingencies Act. And others have developed the point. The Metropolitan Police didn't communicate their assessment of the need to evacuate the building at 26 minutes past 1 in the morning, and did not communicate its declaration of a major incident. The LAS were slow in their coordination of their response and communication with the London Fire Brigade, Incident Commander, and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, well, they really never got off the mark. The plans of the building didn't arrive until after 7:30, after repeated pleas by Andy Rowe. And again, it's uncontroverted that there wasn't really real coordination of responses, certainly in the first 2 hours. Where we pick up the baton, still untouched on this issue, are the lessons to be learned to ensure that the provisions of the Civil Contingency Act are complied with by blue light responders to a major incident. Training. It is palpably clear, sir, from the evidence of Thatcher that he had received limited training on the application of GESIP, and of course the natural conclusion affected his and the other MPS response. Though we've not explored the impact to which the inadequate training had on the provisions of the Civil Contingency Act, or GESIP, we say it contributed to the inadequacy and lack of coordination of the response of the emergency services in Phase 1. It is clearly relevant, sir, to the response of the emergency services, and we would therefore invite this inquiry to examine that issue in Phase 2. Sir, when the Prime Minister announced that you, as chair of this inquiry, on the 29th of June 2017, she expressed a commitment to unearthing the truth and leaving no stone unturned. She vowed that there would be justice for all the victims of this terrible tragedy and for their families who have suffered so terribly. The Grenfell community, though, is still coming to terms with their painful loss. They've engaged in this consultation. They've attended community meetings. They've made submissions on the scope and terms of this inquiry, and they've become many core participants. So, what does it mean that there will be justice for all the victims? It can mean only one thing, and one thing only, that you and your team will do the right thing. And the question is, when? When will you do the right thing? Well, I say time is at this stage because, as Martin Luther King would say, it is always the right time to do the right thing. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. I think we're going to hear from Mr. Mansfield next, but again, I think it might be convenient to have a short break to reorganise things. So I'll rise and we'll start again at 12:05, please. Thank you. Now, Mr. Mansfield, you're going to make a statement on behalf of the G11 group of BSRs.
Yes, well, thank you.
Good, thank you.
And good morning. Coming last as I do, this is an interesting and reflective moment, because I made it clear in writing that although we've made written submissions, and they will be no doubt placed on the website at some point, if not already, you will have read them, and I don't intend to read them out. But what I would like to do is to use a moment of reflection about, initially, the variety of approaches within the group that we all represent. In other words, we would want to disabuse anyone of thinking that we're homogeneous and that therefore you can expect the same reactions from everybody. They lived on different floors, they came from different backgrounds, and just like any community, they have different responses. And I've no doubt at all that that will remain. There are some very common responses, and I'm going to concentrate on some of the common ones because there is really picking up a theme upon which the last statement ended, Leslie Thomas talking about time. And I want to develop that because that is something that you will have seen running through the bereaveds themselves, the witnesses. Just under 3 weeks ago, there was a report published, 23rd of November this year. And I'm aware that people who read it, and no one's disputed its accuracy. It was in fact commissioned by the Labour Party, but that matters not who commissioned it. The actual facts that they revealed are startling and stark, and there is a lesson within that very report which you may derive some substance from in relation to how matters proceed from today. That report revealed that out of 837 high-rise, according to the definition, above 30 metres and 10 stories, 137 of such blocks in London, only 32, roughly 4%, had sprinklers. Now, I began in my opening with a very simple back to basics provision. I'll return to it briefly in a moment, but I'm starting with another one. Sprinklers. Before Grenfell, there were only 9, so they've increased a bit. So, put another way, 96% of high-rise council-owned blocks in London don't have sprinklers. Now, in 2007, the guidance was changed a bit. Somebody, somewhere, actually woke up to their efficacy. And in fact, may I say, no one's disputing their efficacy. Not that they would put out the fire here in this case, that would never be the suggestion, but that they make a major contribution. And the Commissioner, who has been described on many occasions in different ways, I'm not going to add to it other than the fact that she lent her support as a key feature in fire suppression, and that is the provision of sprinklers. Now, I'm not going to labour just that because it has a much bigger context, and this is what I suspect you and the families will be saying, and it's a context which, interestingly, the BBC and Mr. Menon himself this morning, maybe that this is the source of the example he gives. The BBC, barely a month before that report, had a film which we would urge people to watch at some point. The Fires That Foretold Grenfell. There were 5 fires spread over 45 years. And I want to mention them, not in great detail, they can be researched. The first one Mr. Menon mentioned was Summerland in 1973, 45 years ago on. It was followed by Knowsley Heights in Merseyside, Garnet Court in Irving, Harrow Court. Lakanal was the last one they took. Lakanal's very familiar. And of course there have been others. What is interesting about the film, in a sense, besides the detail, is that anyone who's watched it will recognize there are discernible themes. The discernible themes throughout, starting with Summerland, are the 3 themes I'm going to suggest that are perhaps closest, there are others, closest to the hearts of possibly everyone who sits in this room who's concerned with what I call the prism of safety, that what has to be placed here is not the prism of profit, but the prism of safety, if we are to move forward. Now, the 3 themes, I suspect by now everyone in the room could guess what the 3 themes are. The 3 themes were, firstly, given the nature of the fire in 1973, where 3,000 holidaymakers were trapped in this building, burning globules of acrylic rained down on them, spreading the flames. 51 people died. It was, in fact, at that stage, the worst disaster since the Blitz, which I can't say I remember, but certainly there are distant memories of what happened then. So inflammable cladding, or if you like, envelope, was extremely relevant to that fire. That's the first one. The second one won't surprise you either. It is the one I've just touched on. In 2018, only 4% of buildings, sprinklers, would have made a difference. And of course, the third one, stay put. So when one looks at these 5 fires and the themes that repeatedly come up, it's not just that there were themes that were identified, but that there were investigations, there were inquiries, there were recommendations on all those topics. That large buildings should not be clad in inflammable materials. It's almost, well, it is common sense. Oh yes, there's expense. Oh yes, there are ways of getting around it. And no doubt those who wish to do that will continue. Another topic. But there it is, writ large. From the beginning, large buildings should not have cladding that is inflammable. There will be disputes over what's inflammable, but I leave that for the moment. And it was recommended that sprinklers be installed in all large buildings. And finally, that the policy of stay put should be reviewed. So here we are, 45 years later, waiting. in relation to those three things and a large number of others. And we say the importance, therefore, of reflection on what the various people on the various floors who've been lucky enough to get here and have survived have to say on these topics is important, because there is a risk, unless that is listened to, and I think the word was just used, it's time now. The question is, when is now? And what is now? And I will come to that, but before I do, it's instructive to remind ourselves of the force of those who we all represent in this inquiry. And I've only asked for a couple, but I think it eases your burden and possibly those in the public if this particular section could be put on screen. I have, as it were, had a conversation with Ralph, and he's aware. This is the first one, and it relates to a gentleman called Nick Burton. You have it in your in your own. A small part of what he had to say has already been referred to, but I do wish to read this, and it can be followed, because one sees in the context I've just spelt out of 45 years of talk and very little or no action, it's hardly surprising once you get to Grenville that you have Mr. Burton saying the words that he does. It begins on page 89. It's day 68 for anybody who's wanting to look it up. And it starts with these words. I will just keep it sweet. This is an historic event. The consciousness of the nation is looking at all of us. How this inquiry, how the police investigation is going. But this is so important that it has to stop here. We've seen failings and failings. I've been failed so many times, failings and failings and failings with other fires and other lessons not learned. So, Grenfell has to stand for something. And it's to stop here about how people are treated and how the loopholes in the system need to be closed, We, as the survivors and everything, we're fighting against a system that is broken. And they know it's broken, but they usually put a sticking plaster over it and move on. No disrespect with the inquiries, but I think that's just a system initially to save the government of the day any embarrassment. Oh, we're going to have an inquiry to find out the truth. And then time lapses. We do get hopefully to the bottom of this and to find out the truth, but it's over a long period of time. We've spent time with the Hillsborough families. We've spent time with other people, Doreen Lawrence. I've been going around the country myself, going to Manchester, Plymouth, Portsmouth, talking to people, and they are absolutely scared of living in tower blocks with that cladding still on. So, the system is not working. We meet up with, the Prime Minister downwards, all the housing ministers. They talk the talk, but, this has to be the one where it stops. Justice for me is that, this never happens again. We have a fair system. We've got a lot to deal with, especially in this environment at the moment. But it has to stop here. It can't go on. And then we'll be talking about another major incident where there is a fire and a loss of life. And then we're talking about, did we learn any lessons from Grenville? Did we learn anything from Hillsborough? Did we learn anything from anything? it has to mean serious stuff. I mean, we've all been through a lot. We've got families here now, you know, that have had lost multiple people, and it's been very, very challenging. So, you know, the weight of responsibility is yourself. You know, to make recommendations, may I emphasize the word he's put, now. And put them into place now. And not just wait for a report and then the government say, yes, we've got the report and now we're going to think about another consultational process to go through things. It has to stop here with Grenfell. And Grenfell, I believe, will mean something. You know, changes in regulations, changes in attitude, social housing, all these big things that previous governments have been just, wiping away because it's not their concern at the moment. And that's why lives are lost. So, the lessons have to be learned here and now. And stop here, I think. And you then acknowledge him and thank him. And we noted that you did that regularly. And we also noted that your counsel, Mr. Millett, also, I think it was rather late on a Friday, possibly a Thursday, but late in the day, that's not meant to be any kind of criticism, but paid a very real tribute at the end of all those we represent, coming here and giving evidence, a tribute to their courage. And in a sense, that tribute now needs to be translated. And we appreciate, all of us, how do you translate it? How do you translate it now? And I do want to address that particular point, because the history shows we've waited too long. We want no more Grenfells. That's the theme, the repetitive theme which needs to be writ large and on our hearts as we move forward. And there is a way forward now that will give confidence to the public and to particularly the families who've suffered so much, if the process of, in fact, shifting what has been the manoeuvrings, the machinations, I opened, I think, those will remember, June the 14th, oh, the very same day of the fire, those who were meeting in private, the construction industry and government representatives, to see how they could dismantle more of the regulations. No one should ever forget that happened on the very same day. Haven't heard much of it since, but that's what has to be shifted. Now, in order to, as it were, displace that force which underlies, if you like, the austerity cuts point that's been made, in order to displace that and restore the confidence of people who are so scared they won't live in these blocks, it's a form of arrogance, it's a form of complacency that runs throughout and no doubt will rear its head in phase 2 when some of the responsibility can be more clearly identified than it has already. But there is an institutional lethargy. 45 years. There's always a reason why you can't do something now. That should always be overridden by necessity. Necessity to ensure safety. Of course, they'll say, for sprinklers, oh, we don't know we've got enough water. Well, perhaps it hardly bears examining. And then it's the cost, so we can't do it now, but we'll do it. When one looks at and compares the resources that are spent on, not that I understand it, quantitative easing, and a lot of other examples where billions are spent. It's where there's a will, there's a way. And that's where, if you're able to, you can bring the influence of the position in which you've been placed. As Mr. Burton said, the weight is upon your shoulders. It's one, I'm sure, that will be borne with great dignity and with thoroughness. So everyone, in a sense, depends on that being carried through. And in fact, it's displacing something that was described by Bishop Jones when he did the review post-Hillsborough. It hasn't actually been given a title, but it has a title, and it's an apposite title. And it's really the task ahead here. The title he gave it, The Patronizing Disposition of Unaccountable Power, was how he was describing what had been happening before. And in a sense, that is what we're now facing. Accountability comes next, disposition we've already seen a bit of. And therefore, just going back to sprinklers for 1 second, one of the things, but there are others I'll come to, one of the things that could be considered right now. It is being considered elsewhere, but as always, the action has yet to follow. Retrofitting of sprinklers on those existing buildings I've already mentioned. So we get not 96% without, but 96% or more with sprinklers. And really, when you look at it, it's incredibly modest suggestion. And I'm not saying I go all the way with the suggestion. The suggestion is it's only going to apply to high-rise, over 30 meters, 10-story. And if I can just stand back for a moment, what we've heard, well, yesterday sort of completed the picture from the London Fire Brigade. The reason why it's modest in this sense is that if one focuses on that, one, sprinklers are not controversial in terms of efficacy, and we're dealing with blocks where people above the 10th floor actually can't expect security from fire, because the fire brigade haven't got the appliances, and perhaps they don't exist, to go above 30 metres. No doubt if they did, the ladders themselves would be unstable. There may be the odd exception to that, but not as a general provision. So if you're living over the 10th, you're not going to get a fire fought from the outside, which is, of course, why sprinklers just might be relevant to that. And we're now told you can't expect the London Fire Brigade to be fighting fires simultaneously on multi-floors because we believe in compartmentation. So the same people in those upper floors aren't going to get much help as far as firefighting is concerned. And please understand, this is not intended as a criticism of the London Fire Brigade. It is a criticism of a system that is dependent on a predication, which I want to question, about compartmentation. But it does mean that were you able, in the ensuing months, and hopefully weeks, able to consider a sprinkler retrofitted outside and inside these buildings in London. Of course, there are many, many more in the rest of the United Kingdom, so I'm not wishing to be exclusive in this, in the way I approach it. So, and if I can bring forward something I was going to leave to the end, but it fits in here. The reason why that example, and it is only an example, but there are many others, hark back to something that happened in the summer when you very kindly allowed me to make a statement here, which was not, well, was forewarned, but not exactly the content. And it was a plea to which you responded. The plea then, before we broke for the summer, was interim recommendations should we say, and we still do say, be split into those that do not require any more consideration after 45 years, ones that are not essentially controversial, and ones that are, even on the established view, actually when you install them, are going to save money, but more importantly, contribute to the saving of lives. The worry that the families have, and it's perfectly understood that the burden you carry involves a hinterland of documentation, a hinterland of witnesses, a hinterland of issues, and nobody here expects that you will go away tonight and write up the whole thing. It's impossible. Everybody recognizes the impossibility, in a sense, of the task of really doing it quickly might seem unseemly. So you can't do that route either. But there is a middle route here which would achieve confidence. In other words, you can be, if I can put it that way, the first public inquiry ever to be able to do something unusual, and that is to say, well, we've heard enough already on certain issues, I can name some of the others, obviously, sprinklers is one of them, to actually make these recommendations now so that action can be taken, and I as chair here, plus two others, panel by then, will monitor what's going on, and by the end of the inquiry, and I think no one doubts that the likely end is certainly not next year, but possibly the year after, but even that, I don't preempt whatever's in store here. I'm only trying to preempt the need so eloquently expressed by Mr. Burton. That need has to be satisfied now, is the word that's been used. And of course, how you satisfy it is really the important thing. So, that's one of the three themes, sprinklers. I want to move a little closer to the substance of those matters you've heard. And as you've heard so much from others, I'm not repeating what they've said, other than to, as it were, cull from what they've said. Matters which I think, different though the families may be, there are certain areas where there will be agreement. And I'm going to take it in a sense, logically, because you're here at this stage looking at the cause of the fire itself as well as the emergency response. May I endorse, and I don't repeat, everything that Mr. Menon said this morning about Mr. Kebede and the origin, electrical origin of the fire, and everything he said about, again, the manoeuvrings of those responsible for the manufacture of the item concerned. And he gave the figures. I don't repeat those either, but they're also illustrative of the kind of background I've already indicated more generally about other issues. And of course, just to, as it were, remind you of what's been said by one of your experts, the domestic fire is a certainty. It's inevitable. I dare say everybody in the room at some stage or another has experienced it. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious about this, but every time we have a toaster on fire or the frying pan on fire, I don't think the local fire brigade would be too happy to be called out to deal with it. And that really would be a waste of resources, because most, again, the same expert went on to say, all the big fires start with small ones. And the small ones nearly always are, as Mr. Menon was describing, starting, and the expert, in a very small way, usually and almost inevitably accidentally, in all these cases. And this one is the same. So accidental small fires have to be countenanced when you're dealing with safety. Now, I've mentioned this issue, and I know I've been identified with it perhaps too closely, but I'm not going to elaborate on it. This fire originally was extinguishable. It wasn't actually, at that stage, a fire. Mr. Kebede woke up, the smoke alarm was going off, only in the kitchen, not in the hallway. He goes into the kitchen, he sees smoke, I think he said 2/3 of the height of the fridge freezer, coming from the fridge freezer behind it. That's the stage at which were there materials available to him. It's no criticism of him, and those who represent him should not imagine that this is remotely intended as a criticism of him. Of course it isn't. What we're really saying is, and it's interesting because you've heard it from witnesses in this phase, before the refurbishment there were fire extinguishers in the premises, not on every floor. Some people seem to remember they were only on the ground floor, where there happened to be, of course, at one stage, caretaker, concierge, or whatever, so that if there's a worry that the individual member of the public might not know how to use a fire extinguisher, the caretaker would. Now, I mention all of that because moving from sprinklers, that's the next one. Consideration being given, as it is in most public buildings, even this one, to accessories that can help stop the fire in the first place. But of course, there's a bigger issue than this, so I move from that. So that's the seat. We say you can make a very clear finding of where it started, a very clear, as it were, finding as to the next stage, namely, that it basically gets out of this kitchen and ignites the cladding, however comprised, whatever you call it, a system or a number of components. Arconic in their own statement have made it very clear. All the components pretty well. They're not all responsible for all of them, but that matters not. They accept that they were all inflammable and that they knew they were. So what they say is, oh well, so did the people using it know that they were. So what have we got here? A hornet's nest of people who know they're using inflammable material. Oh, but we've used it for years. Exactly. The 45 years we've been waiting for something to happen to the regulations and so on. So we say, this is another thing. So I've moved from sprinklers to extinguishing materials, now to the basic situation of inflammable materials on the exterior of the building, going back to Summerland. Enough has been said about it. All I would ask is that you give consideration now to doing what the government has begun to do, and I'm not going to elaborate how far it should go. At the moment it's restricted. There are certain buildings excluded, and local authorities are being empowered to remove it from buildings that exist. So a statement from you, so having heard intimate details in phase one, is going to carry more weight than the housing minister or anyone else at the moment, and would lend force to the suggestion that there has to be a ban. But we use a different word at this point, and I'm trespassing into the next stage, but I only do that because it provides you with an avenue of the now, answering what can I do now without prejudicing everything else. And because the evidence in this particular aspect is so overwhelming, the word massive, flagrant, they've all been used, and you've got, of course, basically a building that wasn't fit for habitation. There's not much more that you need, really, other than to say that the reason, the basis for the unfitness has been well established, and therefore the word we want to use is a moratorium now. Now, it may be a fruitless exercise at this point to make the finer distinctions about a moratorium. There is a body of opinion that thinks at this stage, until it's finally attested that it should be restricted, in other words, nothing less than A1. Not even the top grades S1DO of A2. It may well be they'll come to be exactly the same. It may well be they'll be equivalent and have the European approach. But until, and this is the point, in fact I think Mr. Walsh in a sense said it yesterday, you know, should we be approaching everything on the basis that it's all going to collapse? Well, don't go that far, but I think it would improve matters if the approach was taken that we cannot afford, I mean economically and personally and socially, we cannot afford another, everybody says it, so we've got to be seen to be taking the steps, which means to everyone that we mean business here, and it isn't a talking shop, as so many people have referred to previous inquiries and so on. And a moratorium satisfies that, because it's not actually saying it's the final decision, it's saying just for the moment until we know finally that A2 top grade is the same, then that can be let into the club as it were, but maybe not for the moment. But I don't spend a lot of time on that distinction, because more importantly is your willingness to go that extra stage. And it's important because it affects the removal point that I've already touched on. There are 157 buildings in London that still have cladding. And those buildings, although the attempt's being made to take it down, you would think after this lapse of time there wouldn't be a single building in the United Kingdom, publicly or privately owned, which would have the materials similar, which are far, far less obviously than A1, A2, grades I've mentioned, would not be on a building anywhere. Yet it is. So it needs a push. It needs a bit of an initiative, if you like, a bit of elbowing, and a nudging, which would not be out of place and would actually earn, I'm not suggesting you need to earn respect, but the inquiry needs to reassure the public that it really has got safety at its heart. So the cladding issue is important. It also bears upon something else, which would come at the other end, would come at the interim recommendations, but I incorporate it here. Because the interesting thing is, of course, that the cladding and the associated materials were non-compliant. Everybody said it. No one's denied it. So how come? How come they did that? And it leads to what has been floated. And I raise it again now. I did put it in my opening, and I put it here again, just as a theme that needs to be popping up. So one has to have regard to it, and that is the need now for people to work on, and I don't suggest you'd be able to come back after Christmas or early in the new year with answers to this one. This does require more thought, but you would by now have thought there must be quite a lot of frameworks there. Well, there is one. Dame Judith Hackett came up with one. She called it a joint competent authority, a regulatory authority. The problem with her suggestion is that it constitutes most of the usual suspects, so it's not truly independent. But what we are suggesting needs to be established, and unless the thinking is going on now, we'll have another 10 years while it goes away, as it's put by Nick Burton, for another set of consultations. So one needs to get the, as it were, the brain cells of those who are working in this field as to the establishment of the authority, who runs it, their ability to investigate and have an inspectorate. Because obviously the idea that another building can cut corners because as it were, the corporates involved in provision and the local authority and more have not, as it were, themselves considered complying with the law, that has to be overtaken. And the public have to be aware, and so does industry, that we can't have any more red tape meetings, deregulation and so on. It's got to be re-regulation such that the inspectorate itself is able to identify what has been called the duty holder in these circumstances, who is going to be responsible for security against fire in these situations. And we have to do that because you can't trust, unfortunately, as it's been put in that heading, the unaccountability of power. So it has to be brought about that. And of course, the people who are, as it were, part of that authority themselves have to be clearly independent of the industry. They need to have a knowledge of it, but they should not be part of it. That's not to say the industry should not have some representation. So one sees straight away there's a raft of areas where you might be able to tread now fearlessly, robustly, in order to engage not only the public, but the government of the day, whichever that happens to be by then. So, I'm moving into, that's the start of the fire, the spread of the fire, and the measures that should be considered. And I'm going to obviously link it to the fire service, which I'm coming to now, and the emergency response to the cause of the fire. And plainly, there will be differences, and one shouldn't shy away from it, of how the firemen are approached and so on. And really using the word heroes is not necessarily the word they would want used. The fact is that it wasn't caused by the fire brigade. The majority go there with a genuine intent, desperate intent to help. The majority. There are obviously exceptions, as there is in any institution. That doesn't absolve us from looking at, and for them too, looking at how matters might be improved for the future. It might not have cracked this one, but it's, again, going back to things that were already in place. So we're not talking about anything particularly revolutionary or hasn't been thought of before, knee-jerk reaction. No. If one looks at, I take one sheet, you have it in the various things. I'm going to ask for it to be put on the screen, and that is Appendix 1 relating to the Act in 2000, the Fire and Rescue Services Act. Can that just be slightly enlarged? I don't know. Perhaps it's just me. So, because I do want just before lunch. Ah, right. And I thought it'd be right. I know it's been mentioned many, many times, and it's also mentioned in our written submissions, but also we've done a series of tables. I'm not going through them all. Table 1 of the 7 tables that we provided you actually sets out in detail, if you like, fire safety policy and all the documents you've heard about. It's all there in the one document. And what is important here is not so much what else could the fire brigade have done on the night, an impossible fire out of control. We know that. We realise that they were faced with an inferno. Whether it should have been anticipated, I leave for the moment. I really want to go back a step. And that's what this document really does. Appendix 172D. Again, not expecting, as perhaps Mr. Menon thought, that every fire officer who goes there can do everything. No, that's not the point. The point is creating a different approach to safety, a different culture to safety, so that fire officers do not have to face the difficulties they do, once you obviously overcome the cladding, the sprinklers, the doors, the windows, and all the other features, active and passive, some of which I'll come to perhaps after lunch. But this document needs to be read and read again, because it's very clear. And I paused on this because there have been various indications of how this is being followed up. But the question I pose is, why has it taken Grenfell before somebody noticed that this material, required here, set out in these many points, hadn't been accumulated, wasn't being put onto mobile data terminals? How often did we hear, oh yeah, we had one, but it didn't work. We turned it on, but we couldn't get any information. It's not just, and that's been conceded very fairly by Mr. Walsh yesterday, or it's in his written arguments, that the collation, recording of information that is vital, and of course they can't do every building, we know that. It ought to be able to. But of course it's all got privatised again, so it's palmed out to somebody else, and actually the job doesn't get done. But the job was specified here. And if you just go through some of them, it begins to ring so many bells, you go, oh my goodness. Starting right at the top, means of access and egress from the site. Well, that's a major problem in the Grenfell Tower. Had anybody worked that out? Had anybody marked it up on a plan so they knew where to go and where to park? They were having to look around for parking spaces when they got there, the various tenders. I appreciate more were called than would necessarily be just the odd one or two. However, all of this, just because each fire in the 5 fires that are in that film are all different. So what do? We stand back and say, well, we can't tell until it happens, then we'll do something. No, sorry. You know the elements that cause the trouble in these fires and that they can be unexpected. So therefore, this is the prism of safety here in this, in a sense, this one document spells it out, the prism of safety, which fire officers on the ground and management should be trained to deal with, and training, as you know, also privatised, and therefore, we say, not properly accorded its place. So, and then we come to the second item, the location and accuracy of information available on site. Well, I think we've all remembered the CCTV and the problems of trying to get information, and of course there wasn't anybody on site as there was before the refurbishment. The location and availability of water supplies, well, that was another issue, water pressure and hydrants and so on, and in fact it's already been referred to that this wasn't compliant either, that's the dry risers, but you've got a series of points all dealing with rising main, inlets, outlets, drain valves, isolation valves, hydrant locations, size of main, parking for pumping appliances within 18 metres of the rising main. What is the point of all this? Is it for somebody's amusement? Is it supposed to mean that the firemen nip round there for a cup of tea and then come back and somebody fills in one of these, they say, oh, we've done the job for the day. That's, I'm afraid, and that is a criticism, I'm afraid this was treated almost as an unfortunate irritant, and that occasionally some of it was written up, but most of it wasn't, and it certainly never got distributed in the way that was originally intended onto the mobile data terminal. So each fire tender going to the scene from Camden, Kent or wherever can press a button and find out, but of course it doesn't work. It's another reason why, when I come to stay put, you cannot depend, I'm afraid, on the human situation and the technology. It doesn't always work. That is why you do have to make the effort to locate and assemble all this information that is suggested. The location of the control room, the fire control room, if provided. Firefighting shafts and protected lobby areas. Location and function of firefighting lifts. Very important in this case. Again, I'm not suggesting had they done it, necessarily more people would have been saved, but you don't know unless, in fact, somebody had done a proper review of this building, because the point also is not just so the fire brigade, who obviously have the safety of their firemen very much at the forefront of their minds, as well as the public. This is also to ensure that the people who own the building or run the building, the management, are told by the fire brigade or whoever they've unfortunately delegated the task to. They come back after a visit and they say to the owners or the management, look here, we've been there, we can't get a fire engine anywhere near, and the hydrant's more than 18 metres away, the water pressure's low, the lifts are not working anyway, where's the drop key and all the rest of it? In other words, they've got a picture here. They have to contribute. They have to contribute to the collective responsibility they have, along with many others, to ensure the safety of the people who are living in the actual building itself. And then, interestingly, the next item, the likelihood and impact of any fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues. Well, that wasn't put there out of fantasy. Somebody realised that there's a possibility that there will be fire spread and that it breaches compartmentation. And therefore there's a potential for multiple rescues and possibly, obviously, although it's not written there, multiple firefighting. So it's not all entirely unexpected, of course. Nobody thought you'd ever get a whole building, as it were, not satisfying everything. Of course, that's not. So what do? We back off and say, oh, don't touch it. No, sorry, you do have to pay attention to buildings where information of this kind would have made a difference to the approach. Perhaps not the result on this occasion, but maybe the result wouldn't have been in the way it was if somebody had alerted the authorities to the way in which this building didn't satisfy and should not have been signed off. Next, occupancy and use profile by the time of day and day of week. Occupancy is important in this case because there's another table. I don't read it out. We've put a table, I think it's 5. Yes, table 5. We've set out there Anthony Disson's name's on the first page, but his name's been mentioned quite a lot in this case. But there are others here. A large number of people who have a disability of a kind, or they're elderly, or they have young children, or they're pregnant, or whatever. Now, one doesn't expect a register to be kept up to date week by week, or that you will necessarily know who happens to be visiting that night. But to have a picture of people who've been there for many years and who cannot easily move, Mr. Disson being one of them, is absolutely vital, a profile. And next, floor layouts and any building construction features which may promote rapid or abnormal fire spread, such as sandwich panels. So what, it doesn't say aluminium, PE, so we didn't think about it. Sorry, again, I hope one's not being too pernickety here. One's just saying somebody, for once, managed to get into an Act of Parliament the criteria which would help all of us if somebody had managed to do it. It's all there. And one has to go back to it every time and say, this cannot happen again, that this gets ignored. That's something else you could say now. That where there are policies or regulations, even now, before we get around to tightening them up, phase 2 or whatever, or the more detailed recommendations, for goodness sake, let's have better attention. And to some extent, the problem here is that the fire brigade response is, well, we've got projects and reviews in hand. Well, we're very happy to hear about that, but it actually needs to be a recognition, not that nothing needs to be changed, and I'm not suggesting Mr. Walsh was saying that, someone else was, but that the projects and the reviews in hand with special units, you don't need all that. What you need is a watch manager and a station manager actually to look at this and say, oh my goodness, yeah, we've got a job here, we better start tomorrow. And you actually depute the fireman on the spot in that station. You say, well, next week you go and do Grenfell Tower. Or You go and do the first half of the list. It's not difficult for anyone. It's not, as it were, so technical that it can't be done. It can be done. So floor layouts and construction features. Plans to show flats. Oh, the fight they had that night to try and get the plans, which should be on site, and there should be a plate and all the rest of it available. Then we go to plans to show flat and maisonette numbers by floor. Well, there's another problem. This all must have been seen by somebody from the local fire station, either on their behalf or from the station itself, so that they were aware you're running into problems here. We don't even know the numbers of they've all been renumbered. And then we get security measures, grills, multi-lock doors. Well, as you know, there was certainly a locked, well, there were problems about getting into the tower and access. That should have been sorted or worked out in advance. And secondly, on the top floor, there was that locked gate onto the roof. And again, these are details that need to be known in case somebody says, oh, they've gone on the roof and you can't get the door open. So, again, details of importance. We move. Plans for automatic fire alarm, fire suppression systems and means of locating the heads. I pause there. I'm suggesting sprinklers now in existing buildings, and if you want to limit it to above 10 stories, all right, just for the moment, just to get it off the ground. But of course, as they rightly point out here, an automatic system that allows for the sprinklers to be activated, and it is said in those who come after me that there was a smoke alarm, but it was silent and activated, in fact, the vents which we're coming to. What we are suggesting, and obviously it can be developed more, and if you need to hear more, that might be one that rests in the wings for the moment. You need an integrated system that alerts the sprinklers, the vents, and all the rest of it once there is smoke detected, and which is sounded, because you've heard evidence that people actually didn't move because they didn't hear an alarm going off in some cases. That's a general one. So, just coming to the next one, it's 5 past. I think it's rather...
Really?
Yes. I'm also aware from various hands going up and down that it's getting rather hot in here.
Well, it is. But I'm quite content to sit a bit beyond the usual time if it would allow you to finish. But if it won't...
No, it won't, I'm afraid. I've got a little bit. I'm doing rather well because, in fact, I'm supposed to be 2 till 3.
Well, but you've got to remember that your G11 slot started nearly an hour early.
Yes. Well, I'm very grateful.
So I think perhaps we should aim at allowing Mr. Beer to stand up at 2:30 or
Oh, yes,
half
certainly.
past 2 and quarter.
I'll finish by then.
Right. Now, as far as you're currently on a point, can you finish this point reasonably quickly? In which case,
Well, yes, I was about to deal with. I can do ventilation. I can do ventilation quickly. The points that we'd want to make here is, and it is a major point really concerned with this particular fire and a lot of others, including going back to Summerland, that is toxic smoke or thick black smoke. This is a real problem because for the individuals living there, besides being subjected to it, it makes it very difficult for them to make a decision about whether to go down the stairs or not go down the stairs. So it's absolutely vital, where you have a building that its fires can't be fought on the outside or the inside above the 10th floor, to have a ventilation system that doesn't blow the smoke into the building, but sucks it out. And that's obviously not what was happening. It wasn't working. The furthest we can go at the moment is, according to Barbara Lane anyway, is that the design was non-compliant. Well, there are some questions to be further asked on that, but you can make a finding, at least at that. It's a non-compliant design for a ventilation system for those living above the, as I say, the 10th floor. This is not a happy situation. So I won't say more about ventilation at the moment than that, because that's a summary of the situation, and we say there should have been an effective ventilation system. And if you look at, I think it's PSB, I can give you the precise reference after lunch, it's quite clear, it's conceded that this ventilation system had faults in the weeks before, and I'll give you the references at 2:05.
Is that a convenient point?
Yes,
from
it is.
your point of view? Right. Well, we'll break there and resume at 2:05, please. Thank you very much.